When does a war stop being something that can still be won and turn into something that can only be survived? Is it measured in the thousands of miles of scorched earth left behind? Or is it found in the silent, frozen breath of an entire army, abandoned in a city that simply refused to die? In the fading, sickly light of 1942, the world held its breath as two titans, representing two irreconcilable visions of the future, locked horns in a wasteland of shattered brick and twisted iron. But behind the thunder of 10,000 artillery pieces and the screams of the dying, a far more silent and lethal force was at work. The unshakable, almost pathological stubbornness of a single man. Adolf Hitler had decided that Stalingrad would not just be a military target, but a monument to his absolute will, a sacrificial altar where the fate of Western civilization would be decided. It was a decision that would not only break the back of his finest army, but would tilt the very axis of human history toward an inevitable fiery end. The tragedy did not begin with the first snowfall, nor with the first biting wind of the steppe, but with a map spread across a polished table in a distant, warm bunker, far from the grim reality of the front lines. For the high command of the Third Reich, the city on the great Volga River was originally just a secondary objective, a flank to be secured, a mere name on the way to the vast oil fields of the Caucasus that were supposed to fuel their dream of global conquest. But as the German boots bit into the dry dust of the endless shimmering steppe, the city's name began to exert a strange, almost hypnotic pull on the Führer's mind. It bore the name of his greatest rival, Joseph Stalin. In the twisted, dark logic of total war, capturing it became a personal obsession that defied every law of military science and every warning of his generals. The goal was no longer strategic, it was symbolic, a struggle between egos that spanned a continent. And in the theater of war, symbols are always paid for in the cold, dark blood of those who have no say in their making. As the German Sixth Army, the most disciplined, well-equipped, and feared force ever assembled in the history of modern warfare, reached the outskirts of the city, they found a nightmare waiting for them that no training manual could have prepared them for. This was not the lightning war they had practiced across the rolling plains of Europe. This was not the swift, decisive movement of tanks across open fields that had brought them so many easy victories. This was a war of the rats, a subterranean struggle where life was measured in minutes. Every cellar was turned into a fortress, every pile of charred rubble became a sniper's nest, and every shadow in the ruins was a potential grave for the unwary. The air was a permanent choking shroud of gray dust, charred wood, and the heavy metallic tang of blood that never seemed to wash away. Here, the legendary German panzers were useless, trapped in narrow, debris-choked alleys where death could come from a broken window, a sewer grate, or a hole in the floor. The Soviet defenders, fueled by a mixture of desperate patriotism and the brutal orders of their own leadership, turned every house into a slaughterhouse. This was a battle for inches, where a single room could be won and lost 10 times in a day, leaving nothing but a pile of corpses and spent shell casings. Yet, as the weeks turned into agonizing months, the order from the top remained unchanged, echoing through the crackling radio sets with a chilling regularity. Stand fast, push forward, take the city at any cost. The cost, however, was being paid by men who had long since forgotten what it felt like to be warm, or safe, or human. By the time the autumn sun began to fade into a bitter, biting gray, the German soldiers had reached the Volga's edge. They could see the water. They could practically taste the victory they had been promised for so long. But they were exhausted, their ranks thinned by a resistance that seemed superhuman, fueled by a desperation they did not yet understand. While the German eyes were fixed on the few remaining yards of the riverbank, a catastrophe of biblical proportions was brewing behind them in the vast, silent spaces of the Russian hinterland. Deep in the forests and across the frozen wastes, the Soviet leadership, silent and patient, had been gathering a storm of steel and fire. They saw what the German generals, blinded by their own perceived superiority and the crushing pressure from Berlin, refused to see. A line stretched too thin, held by allies who lacked the heavy steel and the desperate resolve to withstand a tidal wave. When that wave finally broke in the freezing early morning mist of November, it wasn't a mere skirmish. It was a geopolitical avalanche that moved with terrifying speed. In a matter of days, the hunters became the trapped. The mighty Sixth Army, a sea of hundreds of thousands of souls, was suddenly cut off from the world, encircled in a ring of fire and steel that the soldiers would come to call the cauldron. The encirclement was so sudden, so complete, that for many the reality did not sink in until the first night of the siege, when they realized that no food, no ammunition, and no warmth would be coming from the west. This was the absolute crystalline moment of the fatal decision. The generals on the ground, seeing the iron ring close around them with surgical precision, knew the truth before the maps were even updated. They saw the writing on the wall written in the blood of their scouts and the silence of their supply lines. They knew that a bold, immediate breakout to the west was the only sliver of hope for survival, a desperate gamble to save what remained of their strength. They begged for permission to retreat, to save the men while there was still fuel in the tanks and a flickering spark of strength in their shivering limbs. But from the comfort of his mountain retreat, far from the sound of the Soviet guns and the smell of death, the Führer's voice came back across the airwaves, cold, hollow, and absolute. The Sixth Army will hold its position. No retreat, not one step back. He promised them a miracle. He promised them a bridge of wings that would carry everything they needed into the pocket. It was a promise built on lies and ego, a death sentence signed in ink and delivered to men who were already shivering in their thin summer uniforms as the first lethal winds of the Russian winter began to howl across the open steppe like a choir of ghosts. Then came the great silence, the winter that would swallow an empire whole. The temperature plummeted until the oil froze solid inside the machine guns, and the meager rations of bread turned to stone that could break a man's teeth. The promised bridge of supplies from the air turned out to be nothing more than a cruel, sick joke played on the dying. Instead of the thousands of tons of food and ammunition needed to sustain a starving army, planes dropped crates of useless luxuries, spices, and summer clothing to men who were literally freezing to death in the frozen dirt of a foreign land. The sky above Stalingrad became a graveyard of its own, as the Soviet air defense tore through the lumbering transport planes. On the ground, the German soldier was no longer a conqueror. He was a hollow ghost of a man, a shadow of the pride he once carried. Soldiers bartered their most precious metals, earned in the triumphs of the past, for a single crust of moldy bread or a handful of horsemeat. Thousands simply laid down in the pristine white snow, closing their eyes and waiting for the mercy of the final sleep. The city of ruins had become a vast, open-air tomb for the living, a place where time itself seemed to have stopped. In the dark basements of the city, the distinction between life and death began to blur. Men lived among the corpses of their comrades because they no longer had the strength to move them. Disease, more than the enemy, began to thin the ranks. Typhus and starvation became the silent executioners. And yet, the propaganda from Berlin continued to speak of heroic sacrifices and a coming victory that every man in the cauldron knew was a fantasy. They were being sacrificed to save the pride of a man who could not admit he had lost. The tragedy of the Sixth Army was exacerbated by the failed rescue attempts. A relief force had tried to break through the frozen waste, coming within sight of the city's burning horizon. The men in the pocket could see the flares of their potential saviors on the distant sky, but the order to break out never came. They were told to wait, to hold, to die where they stood. They watched as those distant lights faded, realizing that their last hope was retreating back into the darkness. Even as the situation became utterly hopeless, even as the horses were slaughtered for meat and the bandages ran out, the orders for heroic resistance continued to pour in from the safety of the West. The true tragedy of Stalingrad is not just the unimaginable scale of the dying, but that they died for a goal that had already been lost weeks, if not months before. The stubbornness of the leadership transformed a military defeat into a human catastrophe of unparalleled proportions. As the final Soviet assault closed in like a tightening noose in the early days of 1943, the once proud soldiers were reduced to hollow-eyed shadows, living on little more than frozen dirt and a hope that had long since withered into a cold, hard despair. When the end finally came and the guns fell silent over the blackened ruins, the world realized that the invincible machine had been shattered beyond repair. The German army had lost its heart in the rubble of the Volga, and the long, agonizing road to Berlin was now paved with the bleached bones of those who were told they were the masters of the world, only to be abandoned by the man who sent them there. The surrender was not a moment of peace, but the beginning of a different kind of horror. Thousands of men already on the brink of death were marched into the frozen depths of the East. Very few would ever see their homes again. They left behind a city that had become a symbol of the ultimate futility of total war. Stalingrad was no longer a name on a map. It was a scar on the soul of humanity. Looking back through the heavy mist of history, we must ask the question that haunts every battlefield and every cemetery. At what point does a leader's vision stop being a service to his people and become a nation's slow, agonizing suicide? Stalingrad was the point of no return, the singular shattering moment when the momentum of an entire era shifted toward its inevitable and violent end. It stands as a chilling, eternal reminder that in the grand, cruel game of history, the most dangerous weapon is not the bomb, the tank, or the bullet. It is the ego of a man who refuses to admit he is wrong, even when the world is burning around him and his people are paying the price. The city eventually rebuilt its walls and cleared its streets of the debris of war, but the silence of the hundreds of thousands left beneath its soil speaks louder than any monument or anthem ever could. They remain there, a silent testament to the fatal price of a decision that should never have been made, frozen in time as a warning to all who believe that power is its own justification. History is written by the survivors, but it is remembered in the silence of the fallen. Please like and subscribe to support more content like this.